This week's episode of Dark Side of the Ring focused on the story of Magnum T.A, Terry Allen, who was a fast-rising star for Jim Crockett Promotions in the mid-'80s, likely the next NWA World's Heavyweight Champion, before a car accident nearly killed him and ended his wrestling career. It's one of those what-if stories. It's one of the bigger what-ifs in wrestling history. What if he never had the accident? What if he eventually would have maybe gone to work for Vince McMahon? Magnum himself, his ex-wife, Jim Cornette, David Crockett, Nikita Koloff, Jimmy Garvin, Jake Roberts, Bill Apter. These were all the talking heads for this episode. They got quite a few people. I don't know why Jake was in there. He didn't contribute much to this. I guess because they were maybe in Mid-South around the same time and they wanted somebody representing that territory for that period. That's the only thing I could come up with. Because he contributed the least of everybody in this episode. But Magnum was bouncing at a bar where the wrestlers hung out when he met Buzz Sawyer, who is the one who discovered Magnum. Going back and watching Buzz Sawyer matches on YouTube is always fun. That man could bump his ass off. He could bump his ass off better than almost anybody I've ever seen. But he was a scumbag of a human being. You know, based on any interview I've ever heard from any wrestler that actually knew him or worked with him to a T, it is always the same. He was incredible in the ring, but he was a piece of shit outside of it. And he befriended Magnum. He told him, hey, I think you might have a future in wrestling. But first, you got to get a wrestling license. And that's going to run you about $10,000. Cornette said that in the states with athletic commissions, you did need a license in some states. But they would cost maybe 10 or 20 bucks. 25 bucks at the most. So Buzz conned him out of 10 grand. Actually, more accurately, he conned Magnum's mother out of 10 grand because she's the one who fronted him the money for it. And as soon as he gave the money to Buzz, wouldn't you know, Buzz vanished from the Carolinas. Buzz vanished. I guess he beamed himself back up to the solar system somewhere. Buzz Lightyear over here. He disappeared. He pulled that same stunt on The Undertaker when he first broke into the business. Undertaker has told this story. Now that Undertaker, he's doing a one-man show and, you know, he had his documentary series. He's very chatty now, The Undertaker is. He's got nothing else to do. So Undertaker has told the story that he had his older brother sign up for a co-loan with him so that he could get the $2,000 that he needed to pay Buzz Sawyer to train him. Buzz barely trained him, if you could even use the word trained. You know, he would have guys in his front yard. He would stretch them. He would tell them, all right, come back, you know, the next day for more. And guys were dropping off. And then finally, Undertaker's like one of the last people still keeping up with it. And Undertaker comes back to Buzz's house, and the house is all cleaned out. Buzz left to go to another territory, and he took the Undertaker's $2,000. The only thing Buzz left behind, the furniture, everything was gone. You know what Buzz left behind, just to show you what a big piece of shit he really is? He left behind his 2 dogs. His 2 Rottweilers. He just left them there. I don't know if he left food for them or water, who knows. But knowing him, probably not. So the Undertaker took his dogs. But Magnum did eventually hunt Buzz down in the Portland territory. I think it was Jimmy Garvin who told him, hey, yeah, Buzz is up in Portland. So Magnum went to Portland. He actually went to his house. And he knocked at the door. Imagine Buzz's surprise when he opened the door and he saw Magnum. But he took Magnum downstairs. He worked out with him for about 2 hours. You know, the funny part is Magnum became a much bigger star than Buzz ever was. But Florida is where he met Dusty Rhodes. And Dusty is the one who saw stars when he looked at Magnum. Andre the Giant is the one who gave Terry the Magnum T.A name. Tom Selleck was the star of Magnum P.I. at the time, which was a very popular television show. You had a lot of shows like that at the time, whether it were like cop shows or private investigator shows. You had Magnum P.I., you had the A-Team, you had Hunter, you had MacGyver, and later on, I think in the early 90s, you had Renegade. I grew up in the best era. I'm convinced I grew up in the best era. But Andre told him with the mustache, he looked like Tom Selleck, so that's how Magnum T.A. was born. It was during this time in Mid-South that he got a call from Dusty, who introduced him to Jim Crockett. Dusty's the one who recruited him to Mid-Atlantic. This is when we were introduced to his ex-wife, Tamara, who was married to Magnum, I think it was from 81, they said, until 88. Is that which? I know she said they were married until 1988. And they had talked about having kids and starting a family, but they were waiting until after Magnum became the world champion. I guess because, I can only assume because when you become world champion back then, you make more money. She didn't say why, but they were waiting. So we got a cool family photo that she shared of a baptism that the two of them attended. It was for Dusty's son, a little boy named Cody. You might know him. I'm surprised he wasn't wearing a tiny little suit when he was baptized. This was clearly stuck in there because Cody is on TV every week and they wanted to just have a Cody Rhodes little mention here on the show. But I always like seeing stuff like that. Cornette was talking about Magnum being a sex symbol in wrestling at the time. And he said, these guys had more sex on their way to the ring than he had in his entire life. And you could hear the producer laughing in the background at that one. So Magnum played the part. And he got wrapped up in that rock star lifestyle. He was screwing God knows how many women while his wife stayed home and did his laundry. And that's how she found out the first time that he was messing around behind her back, because she was cleaning his clothes and she found photos of him with a woman, and that woman wasn't her. So that was the first tip-off. But she stayed with him. And even after his accident, he was still sleeping around on her. After he got better and got out of the hospital, he still fucked around on her behind her back. And that's when she said enough. And their marriage fell apart. That's shitty enough. But she was the one who was there for him in the hospital through his recovery. She was the one feeding him and bathing him. And even after all that, he still messed around behind her back. That's very scummy. Nikita Koloff talked about their Best of 7 series, called it one of the best rivalries in wrestling history, where Magnum went down 3-0, but he fought his way back to tie it up before Nikita cheated and beat him in the 7th match. I was surprised they did not cover his feud with Tully Blanchard and their famous I Quit Steel Cage match at Starrcade in 85. When I think of Magnum T.A., that's the first thing I think, other than the accident, the first thing I think of is that cage match with Tully, and the image of him jamming that, I think it was a chair leg, but it was in the shape of like a spike or a scythe or something, jamming it into Tully's forehead as he screams in agony, "Yes, yes, yes!" And, Tully never actually said the words "I quit." He said yes when the referee asked him if he quit. So he can always claim a technicality there. So that never came up, but they had a hellacious feud, and there was no mention of it at all. Maybe because they couldn't get Tully for the show? It's the only thing I could think of. I mean, if they had access to him as a talking head, probably would have covered that over the Nikita stuff. He was supposed to be the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion. The decision had already been made. Starrcade 86 was going to be Flair defending against Magnum and dropping the title to him. First, though, he would feud with Jimmy Garvin. Jimmy Garvin was the hot new heel, but it never really got going. They had some house show matches, you would say, but it never really got going because he had his accident. He was spending very big because he was making big money, and he bought a Porsche 911 Turbo. He had a need for speed. But the night of his accident, he was driving 55 in a 45. So it's not like he was a speed demon that night, driving at 90 miles an hour. But it was October 14th, 1986. He had a match with Garvin. He won. Now he's driving his car home. It's raining, pouring rain outside. He's 5 minutes away from his house. And there's a divot in the road where water had pooled. And so he makes the turn, and he obviously hit that divot, and he starts to hydroplane. He tried to counter, and I guess the way he turned the wheel, that only made the situation worse. He did exactly what you are not supposed to do in a situation like that. So he spun the other way, and he slammed into a telephone pole so hard that he broke the pole in half. And they had pictures of what the car looked like, and it was pretty bad. I mean, it's a miracle he wasn't permanently paralyzed or killed when you look at what the actual car looked like. And he realized he wasn't okay when he couldn't move. He was paralyzed. And they had to use the jaws of life to get him out of the car, and they couldn't airlift him to the hospital because of all the heavy rain. So in the hospital, they told him that he may end up paralyzed from the neck down. They aired local news coverage of the accident, which I had never seen before. And they showed what was left in the news report of the telephone pole, which was crazy. And fans had gathered outside the hospital to place flowers and have candlelight vigils for him. The hospital got what they claim were about 10,000 phone calls checking on Magnum. None of the heels initially went to go visit him in the hospital because of kayfabe. They couldn't be seen visiting him. It's such a weird thing to talk about now because kayfabe is dead and nobody gives a shit. But back then it meant something. You couldn't just have Ric Flair moseying on into the hospital. You'd have a fan that sees Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen going into the hospital, they'd call the cops and say they were coming to put a pillow over the guy's face. There were people who were convinced back then that the Horsemen were responsible for his accident. Like, that's just the way that some of these fans thought back then. To them, it was real. You know, to them, that's Southern wrestling, man. I'm telling you, to them, it was real. But what ended up happening is they convinced a cop to sneak some of them through a back way in the middle of the night. That's how Flair and the Horsemen and some others were able to finally go up and see him. And Flair actually brought the 10 pounds of the big gold with him, big gold belt, and he gave it to Magnum and he told him, I'm giving you this one, and I'm waiting for you to get back in the ring to give you the other one. And that never happened. One of the nicer things that we heard, and it was refreshing because so often on these Dark Side episodes, it's all so dark and slimy, was that because Magnum couldn't make any money when he was laid up in the hospital, the roster chipped in to donate a portion of their earnings, and Crockett matched that, which was a classy thing for them to do when they didn't have to, and it shows how well-liked Magnum was. Crockett Promotions had been building Magnum up to be their champion. He was going to be their guy. There was no plan B. So now they had to come up with a plan B. That turned out to be Nikita Koloff, the evil foreign menace and one of the biggest heels in the territory. All of a sudden now he was turned babyface. And he never won the world title, but he stepped in to fill the void that Magnum left. They put the title on Ron Garvin a year later. He didn't hold it very long. He wasn't a great choice, right? He wasn't nearly as over as Flair was or Magnum. They didn't have anyone else waiting in the wings. Fast forward to April of 1987, Magnum returns for the first time since the accident. He walks to the ring with the aid of a cane, and it was a very emotional moment. It made me think of Hayabusa. The first time he walked to the ring after the botched lion salt that paralyzed him, that was also one of those moments that you don't forget when you watch it. I don't know if the video is still up on YouTube, but I just remember if you have the proper context and you know that this man should not be able to ever walk again, and there you see him walking, even if it was with assistance, that's a powerful image. And so that's what this kind of reminded me of. After this, Crockett makes the deal to sell to Ted Turner, and WCW is born. They framed this as they were riding high, and Magnum had his accident, and it was all downhill from there. Without getting into the real reasons that Crockett went down and had to sell to Turner, which is that they were spending far too much money. They were making money, and they were spending far too much of it. They overspent, and it killed the territory. That and Vince was going to win the war no matter what, because they had Hulk Hogan. And in 87, it was Hogan and Andre at WrestleMania 3. There was nothing bigger in all of wrestling. Crockett could not compete with that nationally. As they tried to go national and expand more, and again, spent money, I mean, they just spent themselves right into the ground. And that was another common theme here, by the way, about Hogan, that Magnum would have been their Hulk Hogan, or he could have been as big as Hogan. I think Jimmy Garvin, that's what Jimmy Garvin said. There's no way. There's no way. Could Magnum have been the face of the NWA as champion the way Hogan was the face of WWE? Sure. But I don't think he would have been anywhere near Hogan's level. That was never going to happen. The episode ends talking about Magnum finding love with his current wife, Courtney, who, for those who don't know, is Tully Blanchard's ex-wife, which makes Magnum Tessa Blanchard's stepfather. At All In 2018, the first All In, when Tessa wrestled Britt Baker, who was it? It was Britt Baker. I think Chelsea Green was in there, and I forgot who the other one was. It was like a women's four-way that Tessa won. But Tully and Magnum were both ringside for the match. You know, Tessa was not interviewed for this episode. As toxic as her name has become, I'm not surprised. But she's always been very complimentary of her stepfather, and I'm sure she would have said glowing things about him here too. It ends with Courtney saying day-to-day life is tough for Terry, but he'll never admit to it. He loves going out and sharing his story to help others, and he's very thankful for all that he was able to accomplish. So it ends on a positive note. It would have been nice to know more about why they show him now using a mobility scooter when it looked before like he was able to walk, and now it looks like he can't. They didn't get into that. But in the episode, Magnum claimed his plan was to be the world champion at the age of 27 and retire by age 30 because he thought running around in your underwear in your 30s was ridiculous. I don't buy that. Maybe he really felt that way at the time. Maybe that was his plan. Yeah, 26-year-old Magnum T.A. may have felt that way. Very few people who say they're going to get out of the wrestling business by 40 actually do it, let alone 30. Especially the lavish lifestyle he was living with all the cars and everything. Come on. If he was making good money, he wasn't going to give that up. I could see him eventually going to work for WWE and getting a run there. I don't think he would have been world champion, but I could see him going to WWE as like a mid-card or an upper mid-card talent. You ask, what if, when it comes to Magnum? I don't think people should downplay the impact of Magnum's injury on the careers of Sting and Lex Luger, who got brought in by Crockett in '87 after the accident. Now, I still think they would have gone on to be big stars, but their career paths may have looked very different, especially Sting in '88 when he first wrestled Flair on that Clash of the Champions show. Maybe that doesn't happen when it happens. Maybe it gets delayed and Sting doesn't really get that first big match or first big title for, many more years. How about when Flair left in '91? Think about that, right? When Flair had his falling out with Jim Herd and he left WCW, it left a huge void. Would Magnum have still been over like he was? Or would he even have been working for WCW at that point? Because if so, maybe they wouldn't have been in as bad a shape as they were, and they could have slotted him in that spot. But that's a big if, right? 86 would have been a lifetime ago by 91. What would his appeal have been nationally outside of the Carolinas and outside of maybe Florida after the Turner purchase? He was playing off that Magnum P.I. look and the popularity of the television show when he first made it big. By 88, Magnum P.I. got canceled, and Tom Selleck's career hit the skids, right? He never had another really big role, I don't think, until he ended up doing that Blue Blood show on CBS. And that was over 20 years later. Or, maybe he stays popular. He stays in the wrestling business through his 30s, despite what he said in the episode. And maybe he ends up being one of the big names during that late 90s boom period, during the Monday Night War. It's not impossible to think that he could have played a role during that period. Ric Flair did. Ric Flair was all over Nitro every single week, and he was older than Magnum was. Luger was there during that very lucrative period. Sting was there during that very lucrative period. All those guys were on top, those guys from the late 80s. Magnum would have only been, 37, 38 at the time of the Monday Night War? That's what I mean when I say he's one of wrestling's great what-if stories. There's so many different possibilities that we'll never know the answer to. But Magnum T.A., he debuted, it was either 78 or 79. I've seen both mentioned. Let's call it 79. His career only lasted 7 years. That's what's so wild about this. Almost 40 years after his accident, people still talk about him. You would think he wrestled for 30 years. He only wrestled for 7. So it may not have been a very long run, but he definitely made his mark on the wrestling business. This Tuesday, they're covering the Graham family. In my opinion, the second most tragic wrestling family behind only the Von Erichs. So I'm sure it's going to get real dark on Tuesday.